If you dig 8 feet into the frozen earth beneath a dying farm, you will either find a grave or a miracle. And in the brutal winter of 1887, 32-year-old Karin Lindgren proved that the ground beneath our feet could keep 16 people from freezing to death when every wooden home around her turned into a freezing tomb. Dakota Territory in January of 1887 was not a place for mercy. It was the winter that old-timers on the northern plains would talk about in hushed, frightened whispers for the next 50 years. The season when the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind came screaming down from Canada like a freight train with no brakes. On the open prairie near the small settlement of Grafton, the temperature did not just drop, it collapsed. Thermometers mounted on the drafty porches of timber cabins registered 38 degrees below zero, while howling 50-mile-an-hour gusts drove the wind chill down to a terrifying 65 below. Out on the boundless range, hundreds of thousands of cattle froze solid where they stood, turned into rigid statues of ice before they could even stumble toward a fence line. Inside the cabins of hardened frontier homesteaders, water buckets sitting right next to roaring cast-iron stoves froze into solid blocks of ice, and the moisture from human breath crystallized into thick, white frost on the interior log walls. Yet, while veteran frontiersmen who had spent their entire lives battling the wilderness burned through their final cords of precious firewood and watched their families shiver under mountain piles of wool blankets, Karin Lindgren was quietly doing something that defied every rule of frontier survival. 8 feet beneath the dirt floor of a dilapidated, ordinary-looking woodshed on her 52-acre claim, she was keeping 16 human beings, 4 laying hens, and a dog perfectly safe, dry, and warm at a steady, unbelievable 58 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no roaring fireplace in that hidden underground chamber. There was no iron stove pumping out thick clouds of dark smoke through a chimney for miles around. In fact, if you had walked across Karin's snow-covered yard on the coldest afternoon of that historic blizzard, you would have seen nothing more than a quiet, weathered woodpile sitting inside a sagging, drafty lean-to. You would have sworn the place was completely abandoned. You would have thought the young widow and her 2 little girls had either fled east on the last train or perished in the opening days of the storm. Because just 2 months earlier, in the mild, golden days of late autumn, the entire valley had believed Karin was losing her mind. Ever since her husband had passed away, leaving her alone to work 52 acres of stubborn prairie soil, the local men had watched her with a mixture of pity and quiet contempt. When they saw her hauling heavy buckets of clay out from beneath her woodshed in the dead of night, her hands bleeding and her back bent double under the strain, they whispered at the general store that grief had broken her spirit. They chuckled into their coffee cups at the idea of a 32-year-old woman digging holes in the dirt when she should have been packing her trunks. None of them was watching her more closely than Ebenezer Thorne. Thorne was the town's primary dry goods merchant, a sharp-eyed, ruthless land speculator who held a $75 mortgage on Karin's homestead. To a wealthy man, $75 was a modest sum, but to a widowed mother on the Dakota frontier, it was a mountain of debt that seemed impossible to scale. Thorne did not want Karin's $75. He wanted her 52 acres of prime prairie land, which sat directly in the planned pathway of the upcoming regional railroad expansion. He had given her credit through the lean summer months, not out of charity, but because he was a calculating man who had already figured out what her land would be worth at a foreclosure auction once the winter cold drove her to bankruptcy. In late October, standing on her front porch with his leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm, Thorne had looked Karin dead in the eye and given her an ultimatum. He told her plainly that if the $75 plus accumulated interest was not paid in full by the time the spring thaw arrived, he would take her land, sell her livestock at auction, and leave her and her daughters with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Karin had not begged. She had not cried. She had simply stood on the wind-swept porch of her sod cabin, her 2 young daughters clinging to her apron, and listened to Thorne's cold declaration. She knew that arguing with a man like Ebenezer Thorne was like arguing with a blizzard. You could not reason with a force that only wanted to consume you. If you want to understand how a woman with no money, no husband, and no formal engineering training, managed to outsmart a ruthless land speculator and survive the deadliest winter in Dakota history. Hit that subscribe button to support our channel right now, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from today, and what is the coldest temperature you have ever lived through. Because what Karin Lindgren understood about heat, earth, and survival was something the experienced men of Flathead and Pembina counties had completely forgotten. To understand how Karin Lindgren stood her ground against both the predatory greed of Ebenezer Thorne and the killing frost of a Dakota winter, you have to go back to the spring of 1885 when her world first fell apart. Her husband, Lars Lindgren, had been a giant of a man, strong, hardworking, and deeply devoted to the dream of building a home on the American frontier. He had carved their 52-acre homestead out of the virgin prairie with his bare hands, breaking the tough sod, digging their water well, and constructing a sturdy one-room sod house with a plank floor and a single south-facing window that let in the bright afternoon sun. Then, in the span of just 48 hours, Lars was gone. It was a sudden, violent case of winter fever that struck him down in the prime of his life at just 34 years old. In the vast, isolated expanse of the Dakota Territory, where the nearest doctor was a day's ride away through mud and slush, there was nothing Karin could do except hold his hand, mop his burning forehead, and watch the life drain out of the man who had been her rock. When they buried Lars beneath a lone cottonwood tree on the eastern boundary of their claim, the neighboring farmers offered quiet condolences, but behind her back, they began counting the days until she packed up her two little girls, 10-year-old Greta and 7-year-old Elsa, and surrendered. A single woman could not farm 52 acres of prairie. A widow could not chop enough firewood, haul enough water, or manage a herd of cattle through 5 months of sub-zero temperatures. That was the unwritten law of the frontier, a law born from decades of brutal experience. But the neighbors who expected Karin to break did not understand the bloodline she came from. Karin was not merely a grieving widow overwhelmed by hardship. She was the daughter of Henrik Lindgren, a legendary master timber framer from Norway's famous Gudbrandsdalen Valley. Back in the old country, Henrik Lindgren had spent more than 40 years studying the ancient building techniques of Scandinavia, learning his craft under old master builders who had inherited knowledge passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. Henrik understood wood, stone, and earth, not as inert materials to be smashed together with nails and mortar, but as living components of an environmental balance. He had taught Karin that human beings had been building homes all wrong for centuries, by placing their living spaces entirely above the ground, fully exposed to the stripping power of the wind and the freezing temperature of the open sky. Long before he immigrated to America in 1871, Henrik had drawn a detailed technical diagram for his daughter on a heavy sheet of brown butcher paper. He had handed it to her on the day she married Lars, telling her that if she ever found herself in a place where the weather threatened to destroy her, she must remember what the old builders knew. The diagram showed the cross-section of an underground living chamber, a structure designed not as a temporary cellar for potatoes or turnips, but as a permanent, passive thermal sanctuary for human beings. The central physical principle behind Henrik's design was deceptively simple. While the air temperature above ground could swing wildly from 90 degrees in the summer to 40 below zero in the winter, the earth beneath the frost line maintained an unchanging, stable temperature baseline. At a depth of 8 feet below the surface, the soil in the northern plains hovered at a constant 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It did not matter if a Category 5 blizzard was howling across the prairie or if the sun was baking the grass into tinder. 8 feet down, the earth remained stable, gentle, and warm. If you built a room entirely below that frost line, you were not starting your heating math at 30 degrees below zero. You were starting your math at 45 degrees above zero. To make an underground room comfortable for a human family, you did not need to raise the temperature by 80 or 90 degrees using massive piles of burning wood. You only needed to raise it by 10 or 15 degrees using the heat of a single oil lamp and the natural thermal radiation of human bodies. Karin had kept that folded sheet of brown paper tucked inside her family Bible for years, occasionally taking it out to trace her father's neat ink lines with her fingertips. Now, standing in the cold autumn wind, with Ebenezer Thorne's foreclosure threat hanging over her head and two hungry daughters depending on her for their very lives, Karin knew the time had come. She would not flee back east to live as a burden on her relatives. She would not surrender her 52 acres to a greedy merchant who viewed her land as nothing more than a profit margin. She would dig into the earth that her husband had died trying to conquer, and she would let the deep, silent warmth of the Dakota soil protect her children from the killing frost ahead. The choice of where to dig was the most critical tactical decision Karin had to make, because in a small frontier community where gossip moved faster than a prairie fire, secrecy was her only protection. If Ebenezer Thorne or the local land assessors learned that she was altering her property or excavating a massive underground structure, they would use local building ordinances or claims against her property to declare the homestead unsafe and force her off the land before winter even arrived. She selected the dirt floor beneath her northern woodshed. The woodshed was a modest, unassuming lean-to structure, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, built directly against the northern exterior wall of her sod cabin. It had a rough plank roof covered in black tar paper, a heavy wooden door that latched securely from the inside, and walls made of overlapping pine boards that were dark and weathered from years of exposure to rain and snow. From the main county road that ran past her claim, the woodshed was completely obscured by the bulk of the sod house itself. Most importantly, it was the place where she was expected to be spending hours every day, splitting and stacking firewood for the winter. In the first week of October 1886, while the autumn leaves were still clinging to the cottonwood trees along the distant creek beds, Karin began her secret work. Every evening, after feeding Greta and Elsa and settling them down with their schoolbooks or sewing near the hearth, Karin would walk out to the woodshed with a single kerosene lantern, lock the heavy wooden door behind her, and pull back the stacks of split firewood from the far northern corner of the floor. Her tools were simple: a short-handled trenching shovel, an iron pickaxe that had belonged to Lars, a wooden wheelbarrow with a squeaky iron wheel, and a heavy leather bucket attached to a hemp rope. The work was agonizingly slow and physically punishing. The top layer of prairie soil was a dense, matted network of grass roots and dark loam that fought against the blade of her spade like woven wire. Beneath that layer lay a rock-hard stratum of yellow clay and fine gravel that required her to drive the pickaxe down with all her strength, breaking up the earth inch by inch before she could shovel it into her buckets. To prevent anyone from noticing the massive amount of dirt she was extracting from the hole, Karin devised a clever cover story. Every morning, before the sun rose over the eastern horizon, she wheeled the heavy loads of excavated clay out of the woodshed and spread them neatly against the southern foundation of her sod house. To any neighbor passing by on the road, it looked as though a diligent, cautious widow was simply earth-banking her home, a common frontier practice where homesteaders piled fresh dirt against their exterior walls to create extra insulation against winter drafts. Over the course of 12 grueling days, Karin excavated approximately 9,000 pounds more than 4.5 tons of dense Dakota clay and gravel. Her hands developed deep, painful blisters that quickly hardened into thick calluses. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that made every breath a conscious effort, and her shoulders felt as though they were permanently bruised from the recoil of the pickaxe against the hard subsoil. Yet, every time she felt her energy flagging, she would picture Ebenezer Thorne's arrogant smile as he stood on her porch, and she would drive the spade back into the earth with renewed fury. By the 15th of October, the main excavation pit had reached its target dimensions, 8 feet deep from the floor of the woodshed, 12 feet long from north to south, and 8 feet wide from east to west. The vertical walls of the pit were cut clean and straight into the dense, pale subsoil, which was so packed and firm that it showed no signs of crumbling or sloughing off. Standing at the bottom of the deep hole, looking up at the rectangular opening of the trapdoor far above, Karin felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. Up on the surface, the autumn wind was cold and biting, whisking away every trace of heat, but down here at 8 feet, protected from the sky by walls of solid earth, the air felt soft, still, and strangely mild. The next major challenge was sourcing structural timber to support the immense weight of the earth ceiling she needed to build overhead. Purchasing lumber from the local mill in Grafton was out of the question. She did not have the money, and buying heavy support beams would have immediately alerted the town carpenters to her project. Instead, Karin turned to the natural resources available on her own land and the surrounding public domain. 3 miles to the west of her claim ran a winding creek bed bordered by an old stand of mature cottonwood trees. Using a crosscut saw and an axe, Karin spent 3 days clearing heavy deadfall from the creek bottom, selecting 7 massive, straight cottonwood logs that measured between 6 and 8 inches in diameter and over 9 feet in length. Hauling 7 heavy logs across 3 miles of rough, unpaved prairie terrain would have broken an ordinary woman, but Karin had an ally, Annika, her sturdy, 6-year-old Guernsey milk cow. Karin fashioned an improvised hauling harness out of old leather straps, burlap sacks, and rope, fitting it comfortably over Annika's broad shoulders. Working in the early morning fog before the valley woke up, Karin and the quiet cow made 4 separate trips back and forth between the creek and the woodshed, dragging the massive cottonwood timbers through the tall prairie grass, 2 at a time. By the 20th of October, all 7 ceiling poles were stacked inside the woodshed, hidden beneath a fresh layer of straw, ready to form the structural spine of her underground sanctuary. With the excavation complete and the cottonwood timbers secured, Karin turned her full attention to the structural physics of the ceiling, following her father's technical notes with mathematical precision. The ceiling of an underground chamber had to do 2 things simultaneously. It had to support thousands of pounds of overhead earth without the slightest danger of sagging or collapsing, and it had to create an airtight, moisture-proof seal that would prevent cold surface air from seeping downward into the living space. Karin cut deep, level notches into the solid subsoil walls at the top of the pit, 6 inches below the woodshed floor level. She laid the 7 cottonwood poles horizontally across the 8-foot span, fitting them tightly into the notches so that their upper surfaces sat flush with the earth. To lock the timbers together and seal the narrow gaps between the round logs, she utilized an ingenious Scandinavian technique her father called frost mortar. She gathered dozens of old burlap grain sacks, soaked them in buckets of cold water drawn from her well, and stuffed the dripping fabric tightly into every seam and crevice between the cottonwood poles. As the freezing autumn air circulated through the woodshed above, the water trapped inside the dense burlap fibers froze solid, expanding and crystallizing into a rock-hard structural ice seal that bound the 7 timbers into a single, unified wooden arch capable of supporting immense downward pressure. Over this timber and ice framework, Karin spread a 14-inch layer of dry prairie straw, creating a thick, flexible cushion that served as a primary thermal break. Over the straw, she replaced 18 inches of the dense subsoil she had excavated earlier, packing the earth down in 3-inch layers using a heavy wooden tamper she had carved from a log end. When she was finished, the floor of the woodshed above the chamber was raised by only 5 inches, an elevation difference so slight that it was completely disguised by spreading a layer of loose wood chips and sawdust across the entire shed. Next came the critical problem of ventilation, a factor that had caused the failure and death of many ill-prepared homesteaders who had tried living in unvented dugouts. A completely sealed underground space holding multiple human beings would quickly experience a dangerous buildup of carbon dioxide, stale air, and high moisture levels from human respiration. If the moisture was allowed to accumulate, it would condense on the cold ceiling timbers, dripping down on the occupants, and creating mold that would render the air unbreathable within days. To solve this, Karin installed a Venturi vent shaft, a specialized passive ventilation system that her father had studied in old Norwegian mining installations. Using a 5-inch long-handled wood auger, Karin bored a diagonal hole through the dense earth at a precise 45-degree angle, starting from the upper corner of the underground ceiling and exiting through the northern exterior wall of the woodshed, 15 inches above the exterior ground line. She lined the interior of the bored shaft with a hollowed-out elderberry pipe, fitted with a downward-angled exterior wooden hood on the cold outside wall. The physics behind this design were brilliant in their simplicity. As the cold, high-velocity prairie winds blew out of the northwest across the exterior of the woodshed, the air moving past the downward-angled hood created a low-pressure zone via the Venturi effect. This continuous low pressure acted like a gentle, natural vacuum, constantly pulling warm, stale, moisture-laden air up and out from the ceiling of the underground chamber. To replenish the exhausted air, Karin relied on natural atmospheric pressure draw. Fresh, oxygen-rich air was drawn down through tiny, controlled microgaps around the perimeter of the entry trapdoor, passing through the layer of dry wood chips in the shed above, which naturally filtered out dust and snow particles. This created a continuous, slow-motion air exchange that refreshed the room's atmosphere once every 4 hours, without ever generating a cold draft or allowing icy surface wind to blow directly into the living space below. For heat retention, Karin constructed what her father's blueprint called a thermal flywheel. Along the entire western clay wall of the chamber, she stacked 52 smooth, heavy river stones that she had collected from the creek bed over the course of 2 weeks. These stones, ranging in weight from 10 to 25 pounds each, represented nearly 850 pounds of dense granite and sandstone thermal mass. The science behind the thermal flywheel was based on specific heat capacity. While air holds very little heat and loses it almost instantly when a draft passes through, dense river stone absorbs heat slowly when exposed to a warm source and then radiates that stored energy back into the surrounding environment over a prolonged period. By stacking 850 pounds of dense stone against the insulated clay wall, Karin created a massive heat battery inside her room. If she lit a single small oil lantern for just 2 hours, the radiant energy from the flame would be absorbed by the dark river stones. Long after the lantern was extinguished to save precious oil, the stone wall would continue to gently emit radiant heat into the small room for the next 14 to 18 hours, maintaining a comfortable ambient climate with zero active fuel consumption. Finally, Karin built the entry portal. In the northwest corner of the chamber ceiling, she framed a 3-foot square opening using heavy oak planks salvaged from an old wagon bed. She constructed a double-walled wooden trapdoor filled with 4 inches of packed sheep's wool for insulation, mounting it to the oak frame with thick leather strap hinges cut from an old horse harness. On the underside of the trapdoor, she installed a heavy slide bolt, made of carved hickory, allowing the door to be locked securely from within the chamber. When the trapdoor was closed and a 2-inch layer of dry cedar wood chips was swept across the floor of the woodshed above it, the entrance vanished entirely. You could stand directly on top of the trapdoor with a lantern in your hand and see nothing but an ordinary, dusty woodshed floor covered in scattered kindling and split logs. On the 28th of October 1886, Karin lowered a simple wooden ladder down through the opening, stepped into the cool, silent, dark room, 8 feet below the prairie, and closed the trapdoor above her head. The sanctuary was ready. By the first week of November, the brief Indian summer vanished from the northern plains, replaced by a dull, leaden sky that hung low over the Dakota prairie. A biting frost seized the earth, turning the topsoil into iron and skimming the edges of the creeks with thin sheets of brittle ice. It was during this quiet, tense window of time, before the deep snows arrived, that Ebenezer Thorne made his final autumn ride out to the Lindgren homestead. Thorne arrived in a high-wheeled wooden buggy, pulled by a sleek bay mare, his heavy beaver-skin coat buttoned tightly against the chill wind. He did not get down from his seat immediately. Instead, he sat for a long moment holding the leather reins, his cold blue eyes scanning Karin's 52 acres with the practiced calculation of an appraiser. He looked at the modest sod house, with its fresh mound of clay banked against the southern wall. He looked at the small timber barn where Annika the cow was standing in the doorway, and he looked at the dark, weathered woodshed sitting silently against the cabin's northern flank. When Karin stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, Thorne finally climbed down from the buggy and walked across the frozen yard. He did not offer a greeting. He simply pulled a thick brass pocket watch from his waistcoat, checked the time, and then turned his attention to her hands. He noticed the fresh calluses, the dark dirt ground deep beneath her fingernails, and the subtle, exhausted slump of her shoulders, Thorne smiled a thin, tight expression that carried no warmth whatsoever. He told her that he had heard strange rumors in town from the local delivery drivers, stories about the widow Lindgren spending her evenings hauling heavy buckets of mud out of her woodshed like a gopher digging a hole. He walked past her without asking permission, stepping through the open door of the woodshed to look around. He tapped the dirt floor with his silver-tipped walking stick, right on the spot where 2 inches of cedar chips concealed the heavy oak trapdoor sitting directly beneath his boots. He looked at the small mound of wood chips, he looked at the neatly stacked piles of split ash along the walls, and then he let out a short, barking laugh. He told Karin plainly that if she thought digging up her shed floor and banking her sod walls with mud was going to save her from the winter ahead, she was even more foolish than her late husband had been. He warned her that digging around timber foundations was a classic amateur mistake that would cause the subsoil to settle unevenly, buckle her woodshed walls, and invite damp earth rot that would ruin her firewood long before midwinter. He reminded her of the $75 debt, his voice dropping into a flat, measured tone that carried the absolute confidence of a man who believed the law and the weather were both on his side. He told her that he had already spoken with a regional buyer representing the Street Paul and Pacific Railroad line, and that the survey team would be arriving in Grafton early in the spring. He advised her to save herself the agony of frozen fingers and a ruined home by signing over her land deed to him now, in exchange for $50 in cash and 3 train tickets back to Minnesota. Karin stood in the doorway of the woodshed, her arms folded across her chest, her face impassive. She looked at Ebenezer Thorne, a man who had never swung an axe, never cut a log, and never spent a single night sleeping in a room where the air was cold enough to freeze water in a cup, and she felt a strange, quiet calm wash over her. She told him calmly that her debt was not due until the 1st of April, and that until the 1st of April arrived, her land remained her own. She advised him to save his horse the long ride out to her claim in the snow, because when the spring thaw came, his $75 would be waiting for him at the bank in Grafton. Thorne's face darkened. He turned on his heel, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away without another word, the iron-rimmed wheels of his carriage rattling loudly against the frozen ruts of the prairie road. The merchant was not the only skeptic in Pembina County. 2 days later, Thorvald Vance, the town's premier master carpenter and timber contractor, stopped by Karin's claim to drop off a repaired iron plowshare he had mended for Lars the year before. Vance was a tall, broad-shouldered man of 50, with a weather-beaten face and 30 years of experience building homes across the territories. He was not a cruel man like Thorne. He was simply a traditionalist who believed there was only one right way to build a frontier structure. Vance walked into the woodshed to check the firewood, his keen carpenter's eye immediately catching the subtle, 5-inch elevation change in the floor and the unusual placement of the cottonwood poles hidden behind the wood stacks. He knelt down, brushed away a handspan of cedar chips, and spotted the edge of the oak frame. He stood up, looking at Karin with a expression of deep concern. He told her with genuine gravity that digging a cavern directly beneath an unreinforced timber lean-to was a recipe for catastrophic structural collapse. He explained that when the heavy prairie snows accumulated on the woodshed roof, the downward deadload would push against the supporting soil walls. Without heavy mortared stone masonry or vertical oak posts, the subsoil would give way under the pressure, collapsing the floor and trapping anyone inside under tons of suffocation clay. He warned her that moisture rising from the damp earth would saturate her split wood, rot her timbers, and create a stagnant, oxygen-poor pit that would suffocate a family within hours if they tried to sleep there. Karin listened respectfully to the old builder. She acknowledged his long experience and thanked him for his advice. But she did not tell him about the Venturi vent shaft angled precisely at 45 degrees through the northern wall. She did not tell him about the frozen burlap frost mortar locking the cottonwood poles together, or the 850 pounds of riverstone holding a passive thermal charge along the western wall. She simply nodded, walked him to his wagon, and watched him ride away into the gray afternoon light. By Sunday, word had spread across the entire settlement of Grafton. At the local Lutheran church and inside the warm back room of the general store, the men gathered around the potbelly stove and shook their heads over the strange widow on the southwest road. They declared that Karin Lindgren was letting grief drive her to madness, that her crazy earth hole was a tragedy waiting to happen, and that before January was over, the county sheriff would be riding out to her homestead with a shoveling crew to dig her out of a collapsed cellar. The universe has a way of testing theories long before the final exam arrives, and for Karin Lindgren, that test came on the night of November 17th, 1886. It started with a sudden, violent drop in barometric pressure that sent the mercury in the thermometer hanging outside her kitchen window plummeting like a stone. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had turned from a dull slate gray to a terrifying ink-black darkness. The wind, which had been blowing gently out of the south all morning, whipped around to the northwest with stunning velocity, rising from a modest breeze to a sustained 40-mile-an-hour gale in under 20 minutes. Along with the wind came the cold. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees above zero at noon to 12 degrees below zero by 8 o'clock that evening. It was a classic Arctic clipper, a fast-moving, razor-sharp cold front that swept down from the Canadian Barrens, stripping the last remaining heat from the soil and driving fine, needle-sharp ice crystals through every tiny crack in the frontier homes of Pembina County. Inside Karin's one-room sod house, the limits of traditional frontier architecture became instantly apparent. Despite the fresh mound of clay she had banked against the southern exterior wall, the relentless 40-mile-an-hour wind found every microscopic gap in the chinking around the doorframe and the window sash. Cold air poured into the living space at floor level like an invisible, icy river. Karin stoked her cast-iron wood stove until the belly of the iron glowed a dull, cherry red, feeding it split ash every 45 minutes. But the heat produced by the stove was instantly swept away by the drafts, rising straight to the roof boards where it escaped into the night, while the floor of the cabin remained an icebox. By 10 o'clock, with the fire burning at maximum capacity, a tin cup of water sitting on the kitchen table, just 6 feet away from the stove, developed a skin of ice over its surface. The interior room temperature at floor level sat at a freezing 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Karin looked at her woodpile inside the cabin. In just 6 hours of intense firing, she had burned through an amount of firewood that was supposed to last her 3 days. If she kept firing the stove at this rate to keep the sod house barely livable through a 3-day storm, her entire above-ground firewood supply would be exhausted before December even began. She walked to the window, wiped a circle of frost from the glass with the palm of her hand, and looked out into the screaming whiteout. It was time. She woke Greta and Elsa, wrapping them in their heavy wool coats, scarves, and fur-lined mittens. She picked up her small oil lantern, a metal tin containing 4 extra candles, and her family Bible containing her father's hand-drawn diagrams. Holding her daughters tightly by the hand, Karin opened the north door of the sod house and stepped into the raging storm. The distance between the cabin door and the woodshed entrance was only 12 feet, but in the blinding, disorienting chaos of a Dakota whiteout, 12 feet was far enough for a person to lose their bearings and freeze to death in their own yard. Karin had prepared for this. A thick, 3/4-inch hemp safety rope was stretched tight between the 2 door frames, anchored with heavy lag bolts. Holding the line with one hand and her daughters with the other, she navigated the screaming darkness and pulled them safely inside the woodshed. Inside the shed, protected from the direct force of the wind, the noise dropped from a deafening roar to a steady, muffled rumble. Karin quickly swept away the loose layer of wood chips in the northwest corner, revealed the heavy oak trapdoor, and lifted the hickory slide bolt. She swung the door back on its leather hinges, exposing the dark, square portal leading down into the earth. One by one, she helped Greta and Elsa climb down the wooden ladder, then lowered her crate containing the 4 laying hens, and finally climbed down herself, pulling the heavy wool-insulated trapdoor shut behind her and sliding the hickory bolt firmly into its iron keeper. The silence was instant, absolute, and overwhelming. Down inside the 8-foot-deep chamber, the screaming fury of the 40-mile-an-hour gale vanished, replaced by a quiet so profound that Karin could hear the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the soft, rhythmic rustle of the hens shifting inside their wooden crate. She lit the small oil lantern, hanging it from the iron hook in the central ceiling timber, and looked at the wall-mounted thermometer she had hung next to her father's drawing. Before lighting the lantern, with the room having been sealed and unused for 2 days, the air temperature 8 feet below the prairie registered 48 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact baseline temperature of the surrounding subsoil. Karin let the small oil lantern burn for precisely 2 hours. The modest heat output of the single flame, generating roughly 1,200 British thermal units per hour, was instantly trapped inside the small 12 by 8 foot room. Because the earth walls had an effective insulation value exceeding R30, and there were no wind drafts to strip the heat away, the air temperature inside the room climbed steadily. 50 degrees, 52 degrees, 56 degrees. More importantly, the 850 pounds of dense river stone stacked along the western wall began to perform their engineered function. The stones absorbed the thermal energy from the lantern flame, their dark granite surfaces warming to the touch. At the end of 2 hours, when the chamber had reached a comfortable 58 degrees Fahrenheit, Karin turned the wick down and extinguished the lantern to conserve her oil. For the next 14 hours, while the Arctic Clipper raged across the surface world, dropping temperatures to 15 below zero outside, Karin and her daughters slept comfortably on the clean straw floor of the underground chamber beneath 2 simple wool blankets. There was no active fire. There was no wood smoke. There was no draft. Every 4 hours, Karin woke to check the thermometer by the light of a single match. The temperature did not plummet. It did not swing wildly. The 850 pounds of river stones slowly, continuously released their stored thermal charge back into the room, offsetting the minor heat loss through the floor vents. At 6 o'clock the following morning, 14 hours after the lantern had been extinguished, the thermometer in the subterranean chamber read a stable, unbelievable 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Above ground, the sod house was a frozen shell with ice coating the hearth. Below ground, a mother and her children were sitting in their shirt sleeves, eating warm cornmeal porridge and reading stories by candlelight. The physics had held. The master builder's blueprint was true. If November had been a warning, January of 1887 was the apocalypse. History books would later record it as the Great Die-Up, a catastrophic convergence of meteorological disasters that permanently shattered the open-range livestock industry of the American West and changed the northern plains forever. It began in the first week of the new year, when a massive, supercooled atmospheric pressure system settled over the region, locking Dakota Territory, Montana, and Wyoming in a deep freeze that lasted for 23 consecutive days. This was not a temporary cold spell. It was an unbroken, stationary mass of Arctic air that pushed surface temperatures to unimaginable extremes. In Grafton, the official weather station recorded temperatures dropping to 39 degrees below zero, while remote homesteads out on the open prairie experienced localized lows that touched 42 below. Along with the cold came the snow, not in soft, gentle flakes, but in relentless, wind-driven waves that accumulated until the prairie landscape was transformed into a featureless ocean of white. Drifts piled up to 10, 12, and 14 feet in height, burying entire single-story homesteads up to their rooflines. The cattle industry suffered a blow from which it would never truly recover. Over 400,000 head of range stock, unable to break through the 3-inch crust of solid ice that coated the grass, wandered helplessly before the freezing winds until they reached fence lines, where they piled up against the wire and froze to death by the thousands. For the human homesteaders scattered across Pembina County, the situation rapidly devolved from a struggle for comfort into a desperate battle for sheer survival. Conventional building methods, designed for milder eastern climates, failed completely under the unprecedented thermal stress. In the timber cabins and frame houses across the valley, heat loss was catastrophic. A standard log house, built with 8-inch pine logs and mud chinking, offered an insulation value of roughly R8. In normal winter weather of 15 or 20 degrees above zero, a roaring wood fire could generate enough thermal energy to offset the heat loss through the walls. But at 39 degrees below zero, with a 40-mile-an-hour wind pushing against the exterior, The temperature differential between the inside air and the outside world was over 100 degrees. Under that immense pressure, thermal bridging occurred rapidly. The log walls themselves cooled to below freezing throughout their entire thickness. Heat from indoor stoves moved through the timber and chinking like water through a sieve. Homesteaders found that even with their stoves packed full of hardwood and burning at dangerous red-hot temperatures, they could not maintain an interior air temperature higher than 35 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit at the center of the room, while the corners and floors remained frozen solid. Worse still was the crisis of fuel. Because the intense cold required continuous maximum capacity firing of every stove and fireplace in the county, families were burning through their winter firewood supplies at 3 times the normal rate. Wood piles that had been carefully stacked to last through April were completely exhausted by the middle of January. Desperate homesteaders began venturing out into the whiteout blizzards to cut green timber along the creek beds, but green wood, saturated with frozen sap and water, burned poorly, producing bitter, choking smoke and generating less than half the heat of seasoned fuel. When the green wood ran out, people began burning whatever they could find: wooden furniture, barn floorboards, interior dividing walls, fence posts, and even wagon wheels. The moisture from burning unseasoned wood combined with the extreme cold to create another lethal hazard: creosote buildup. Inside the chimneys of cabins across the valley, thick, black, tar-like creosote condensed on the freezing stone and stovepipes, catching fire or clogging the flues entirely. Dozens of homes across the territory were destroyed by chimney fires, forcing families out into the -40-degree night in their nightclothes, where exposure killed them within minutes. Karin Lindgren watched the catastrophe unfold from the quiet security of her claim. But unlike her neighbors, who were reacting in panic to every new drop in the barometer, Karin had spent the mild days of late December executing a methodical, multi-stage preparation plan. She had transferred 40 pounds of dried cornmeal, 30 pounds of navy beans, 2 large slabs of salt pork, 8 gallons of high-grade lamp oil, and 300 pounds of clean well water into the subterranean chamber beneath her woodshed. She had moved her 4 laying hens down into their specialized alcove crate for the winter, where their body heat, small as it was, would contribute to the room's thermal balance. Most importantly, Karin had managed her firewood with surgical efficiency. Because she only used her sod house during mild afternoons when the temperature climbed above zero, and moved her family down into the underground chamber during every major storm and cold snap, she had burned less than 3/4 of a cord of wood by the middle of January. Her woodshed above the chamber was still 3/4 full of dry, perfectly seasoned ash and cottonwood, a massive fuel reserve that made her one of the wealthiest people in Pembina County in terms of sheer survival capital. On the morning of January 9th, as the barometer hit a historic low and the wind began to build toward a crescendo that would mark the worst 72 hours of the entire winter, Karin conducted a final check of her underground sanctuary. The Venturi vent shaft was drawing clean, fresh air from the outside while pulling out stale moisture. The 850 pounds of river stone along the western wall were fully charged, radiating a gentle, consistent warmth. The oak trapdoor sealed tightly against its leather gaskets. Karin lowered Greta and Elsa down the ladder, handed down the lantern and the supply crates, and then paused at the top of the opening, looking out through the small woodshed window toward the east. The sky was turning a dark, terrifying purple, and the horizon had vanished behind a wall of blowing snow that looked like a solid white cliff moving across the prairie. She stepped down into the chamber, pulled the heavy oak door closed, and slid the hickory bolt into place. The blizzard that struck on the afternoon of January 9th, 1887, was not merely a storm. It was a test of absolute endurance that brought the human settlement of Pembina County to its knees. For 48 unbroken hours, the wind howled across the open prairie at sustained speeds of 55 miles per hour, with gusts recorded at 68 miles per hour at the railroad depot in Grafton. The ambient air temperature held steady at 38 degrees below zero. At that wind speed and temperature, the wind chill equivalent was an astonishing 68 degrees below zero, a thermal environment in which unprotected human skin would freeze solid in less than 60 seconds, and where deep lung tissue could be permanently damaged by taking 3 deep breaths of unheated air. 1.5 miles to the east of Karin's claim, Thorvald Vance, the master carpenter who had warned her against digging beneath her woodshed, was facing a total catastrophic failure of his homestead. Vance had built his home using what he believed were the finest timber methods available, a spacious, 2-story frame house with a heavy shingled roof, large glass windows, and a massive brick chimney. But the spacious house that had been so pleasant during the cool summer months became a death trap in the grip of a -38-degree blizzard. The high ceilings allowed what little heat his stove produced to collect uselessly 12 feet above the floor, while the large glass windows, even with heavy wooden shutters closed over them, leaked heat at a terrifying rate. At 2 o'clock on the morning of January 10th, under the immense weight of a 6-foot snowdrift that had accumulated on its windward slope, the roof of Vance's woodshed collapsed with a deafening crash. The heavy timbers caved inward, crushing his storage racks and burying his entire remaining supply of dry, split firewood beneath 4 feet of shattered wood, ice, and packed snow. For 10 hours, Vance and his oldest son fought desperately to dig out the wood, working in 5-minute shifts in the blinding whiteout until their faces were white with frostbite. But the task was impossible. The snow was packed like concrete, and the tools froze to their leather mittens. By noon on January 10th, the temperature inside the Vance home had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife, Sarah, was sitting in the corner of the kitchen with their 4 young children, wrapped in every coat, blanket, and quilt the family owned, their lips blue, and their speech slurred with the early stages of hypothermia. Vance knew the math of survival as well as any man on the frontier. They had no dry wood left. The house was losing heat at a rate of 3 degrees every hour. If they stayed in that frozen frame house for another 12 hours, his wife and children would not wake up in the morning. He made the only choice a desperate father could make. He gathered his family, tied them together with a 50-foot length of heavy hemp rope so no one could be separated in the whiteout, wrapped them in horse blankets, and stepped out into the -38-degree storm. He was not heading for the town of Grafton. At 3 miles away through chest-deep drifts, Grafton was an impossible distance that would have killed the children before they covered half a mile. He was heading for Karin Lindgren's claim, the place he had publicly declared a death trap just 2 months before. He did not know if Karin and her daughters were still alive. He did not know if her sod house had survived the wind. But it was the closest shelter on the prairie, and it was his family's only chance. The 1.5-mile trek through the blizzard was a nightmare that Vance would relive in his sleep for the rest of his life. The wind was so fierce, it knocked the younger children off their feet repeatedly, forcing Vance and his son to drag them through the drifts by their harness ropes. The blowing snow was so thick that Vance could not see his own hands held 6 inches before his face. He navigated entirely by the slope of the land and the direction of the wind against his left cheek. By the time the dark, looming shape of Karin's sod house materialized out of the swirling white wall before them, Vance had lost all feeling in his feet. His fingers were stiff and useless inside his mittens, and his youngest daughter had stopped crying and gone completely limp in her mother's arms. Vance stumbled up to the front door of the sod cabin and pounded on the heavy pine planks with his frozen fists. There was no answer. He threw his weight against the door, pushing it open, and stumbled into the room. The cabin was completely empty. The stove was cold and black. A thin layer of snow had blown through the cracked window pane, coating the floor and the kitchen table in a white blanket. The house was an abandoned, frozen box. Vance fell to his knees on the plank floor, his chest heaving, his heart sinking into complete despair. He had brought his family 1.5 miles through a killing blizzard, only to find a cold, dead house. They had used the last of their energy to reach this place. They could go no farther. Then, through the howling roar of the wind rattling the roof boards above, Vance heard a sound, a faint, dull, metallic thud coming from somewhere beyond the northern wall. He forced himself to his feet, dragged his crying wife and children out through the kitchen door, and followed the north exterior wall around to the woodshed. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The woodshed was dark, cold, and filled with the clean, sharp smell of split pine and dry earth. The wind was blocked by the solid plank walls. And there, in the far northwest corner of the dirt floor, a square patch of wood chips had been swept away, revealing a heavy oak trapdoor with a recessed iron pull ring. Before Vance could even reach for the ring, the hickory bolt on the underside clicked back with a sharp, decisive snap. The heavy oak door swung open on its leather hinges, and a wave of soft, golden light and warm, sweet air poured up out of the earth and into the freezing shed. Karin Lindgren's face appeared in the opening, illuminated by the soft glow of her oil lantern. She looked at the frozen, shivering family standing before her, looked at Thorvald Vance's frost-white cheeks and wild, desperate eyes, and did not ask a single question. She reached up her arms, grabbed the smallest Vance child, and said 4 simple words that Thorvald Vance would remember until the day he died. Bring them down. Quickly. One by one, Thorvald Vance lowered his shivering children down through the 3-foot square opening into the earth, followed by his wife, Sarah, and finally climbing down himself, pulling the wool-lined oak trapdoor shut above his head, and sliding the hickory bolt into its keeper. The transition from the surface world to the subterranean chamber was so instantaneous and profound that it felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into another world entirely. Vance stood at the base of the wooden ladder, his body shaking violently with the uncontrollable tremors of extreme cold exposure. His breath was coming in ragged, painful gasps, his frozen feet numb inside his snow-packed boots, his mind dazed and disoriented by the onset of severe hypothermia. But as he straightened his back and looked around the room, the physical sensations of the environment hit him with stunned, disbelieving force. The air inside the chamber was not merely bearable, it was warm. It wrapped around his frozen face and hands like a soft wool blanket. The room was illuminated by the clear, golden light of Karin's oil lantern, which hung from a ceiling beam, casting warm shadows across the vertical clay walls, the neatly stacked shelves of canned provisions, and the smooth river stones along the western wall. In the eastern alcove, the 4 laying hens clucked quietly in their crate, while Greta and Elsa were already helping his 2 youngest children out of their ice-crusted coats and wrapping them in dry wool blankets. Vance reached into the interior pocket of his heavy wool coat, with stiff, clumsy fingers, pulling out his brass-cased pocket thermometer, the precision instrument he used for fine timber milling work. His hands were shaking so hard he nearly dropped the glass tube, but he held it up to the lantern light, waiting for the red spirit column to settle. He looked at the glass tube, blinked the melting ice from his eyelashes, and looked again. Outside, 18 inches above the woodshed floor, the prairie was locked in a 38-degree below-zero blizzard with a wind chill of -65. Inside the subterranean earth chamber, 8 feet beneath the frost line, the thermometer held at a rock-solid, incredible 58 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wood stove burning in the room. There was no iron firebox pumping out heat. There was no chimney drawing fuel. The entire space housing 10 human beings and 4 hens was being warmed by nothing more than the passive thermal baseline of the Dakota soil, the radiant energy stored in the 850 pounds of river stone along the wall, the tiny flame of a single oil lantern, and the combined body heat of the occupants, which generated roughly 3,500 British thermal units per hour. Vance stepped across the bare earth floor, extended his bare hand, and placed his palm flat against the granite surfaces of the thermal flywheel. The stones were warm, not hot, not burning, but radiating a steady, deep, comforting heat that felt like sun-warmed rock on a late summer afternoon. He looked up at the ceiling, examining the 7 cottonwood timbers, the burlap frost mortar locked solid between the logs, and the 5-inch Venturi vent shaft, drawing fresh air through the room without producing a single cold draft. The master carpenter, a man who had spent 30 years priding himself on his professional knowledge, fell back against the clay wall, slid down to a sitting position on the earth floor, and covered his face with his calloused hands. Tears melted the frost stuck to his beard as he wept silently, not from the pain of his thawing fingers, but from the overwhelming realization of his own foolish arrogance. "We called you crazy," Vance whispered, his voice cracking with emotion as he looked up at Karin. "The whole town called you a foolish widow. We told you that you were digging your own grave. And God forgive us, Karin. You built a sanctuary. Karin handed him a tin cup of steaming broth made from dried beans and salt pork. My father built it, Thorvald, she said softly. I only dug the hole. For the next 72 hours, as the greatest blizzard in Dakota history reached its destructive peak across the northern plains, the hidden chamber beneath the woodshed operated at peak efficiency. On the afternoon of the second day, hearing a faint thumping on the woodshed floor above, Vance and Karin climbed up to investigate and discovered two more stranded homesteaders, Einar Grendel and a young bachelor from a neighboring claim who had crawled into the woodshed to escape the whiteout after their own cabin. Chimney had collapsed. They were brought down into the chamber, followed 24 hours later by the four members of the Peterson family, whose thin frame house had been completely unroofed by a 60-mile-an-hour wind gust. At its peak, the underground chamber sheltered 16 human beings, 4 hens, and a stray farm dog. The ambient temperature inside the room, boosted by the body heat of 16 people, climbed to 62 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. The provisions held, the oil held. The Venturi vent shaft drew fresh air continuously, keeping the room dry, sweet-smelling, and completely free of condensation or stale carbon dioxide. Down in the dark earth, while the world above was being torn apart by an Arctic hurricane, children played guessing games by lantern light, mothers rested their exhausted bodies, and men who had spent their lives boasting of their self-reliance learned the true meaning of humility. On the morning of January 14th, the storm finally broke. The wind died down to a gentle breeze, the clouds parted, and a brilliant, blinding sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue over a landscape transformed into a glittering, frozen desert. Karin climbed up the ladder, pushed open the oak trapdoor, and dug her way through 3 feet of soft snow to open the woodshed door. The air outside was 30 degrees below zero, so cold it made her lungs sting, but the prairie was silent, peaceful, and still. 2 hours later, the sound of jingling sleigh bells echoed across the snow-covered yard. Ebenezer Thorne arrived in a heavy 2-horse cutter sleigh, equipped with broad wooden runners, driven by a hired man holding a whip. Thorne was dressed in his finest beaverskin coat and wolf fur laprobe. He had come out from Grafton at the earliest possible moment after the trails were broken, fully expecting to find Karin Lindgren's homestead buried, her sod cabin frozen, and her family either dead or desperately eager to surrender her land deed for a ticket out of the territory. He carried his leather legal portfolio in his lap, ready to finalize the foreclosure paperwork on the spot. Thorne stepped out of the sleigh, a triumphant, predatory smile playing across his lips as he looked at the cold, silent sod house with its snow-choked chimney and frosted windows. "Mrs. Lindgren," Thorne called out, his voice echoing loudly across the snow. "I see your house is cold. I told you a woman alone couldn't manage this land. It's time to settle your account." The door of the weathered woodshed swung open. Karin Lindgren stepped out into the bright sunlight, dressed in a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her face warm, relaxed, and glowing with health. Behind her, stepping out of the ordinary woodshed one by one, came 16 healthy, warm, well-fed human beings. Thorvald Vance, his wife, his 4 children, Einar Grendel, the Peterson family, and Karin's 2 young daughters, Greta and Elsa, who were laughing and tossing snowballs into the drifts. Ebenezer Thorne stood frozen in the snow, his mouth dropping open, his legal portfolio slipping from his fur-gloved fingers into a drift. He stared at the crowd of survivors emerging from a wooden shed, like people stepping out of a summer hotel, his mind completely unable to process the scene before him. Thorvald Vance stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the dry goods merchant. The master carpenter looked at Thorne with a cold, hard disgust that made the speculator step back toward his sleigh. "Your mortgage is $75, isn't it, Thorne?" Vance said, his voice carrying across the yard like a rifle shot. Vance reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his leather coin purse, and dropped 20 silver dollars into Karin's hand. Einar Grendel stepped forward next, placing $15 in silver into her palm. The Petersons added $12. Within 2 minutes, every family that Karin had saved from the killing frost reached into their pockets, pooling their meager cash reserves in a spontaneous act of overwhelming gratitude and community solidarity. Karin walked across the snow, pulled three $20 gold pieces and 15 silver dollars from her palm, and thrust them hard against Ebenezer Thorne's chest. $75, Mr. Thorne, Karin said, her voice clear, strong, and unwavering as she looked the merchant dead in the eyes. Paid in full. Now get off my land. Thorne looked at the money in his hands, looked at the stern, united faces of 16 frontier survivors standing shoulder to shoulder behind the young widow, and realized with sickening clarity that his scheme was utterly destroyed. He scrambled back into his sleigh, shouted at his driver, and fled down the prairie road as fast as the horses could gallop, his sleigh tossing up clouds of snow behind him. When the spring thaws finally swept across the Dakota Prairie in April of 1887, melting the massive drifts and revealing the green grass pushing up through the rich soil, Karin Lindgren stood on the porch of her sod cabin with her two daughters by her side. Her 52 acres were free and clear. Her debt to Ebenezer Thorne was paid in full, and her family was secure on the land her husband had broken. In her hand, she held her father's worn brown paper diagram, a document that had proven more valuable than all the timber, gold, or land deeds in the territory. Word of the Lindgren Earth Chamber spread like wildfire across Pembina County and throughout the Northern Territories during the summer of 1887. Thorvald Vance, humbled and transformed by his experience during the storm, abandoned his traditional high-framed building designs and dedicated the rest of his career to constructing passive subterranean structures for homesteaders across the region. Within 3 years, more than 40 families across the Dakota Territory had constructed their own underground earth chambers based directly on Henrik Lindgren's principles, saving countless lives during the subsequent winter storms that swept the plains. Karin lived out the rest of her long, peaceful life on her prairie homestead, watching her daughters grow into strong, independent women who carried their grandfather's engineering wisdom down to their own children. She never built a grand mansion or sought fame for what she had accomplished during that terrible winter. She simply remained on her land, working the soil, helping her neighbors, and proving to a skeptical world that true survival is not born from brute force or expensive machinery, but from honoring ancestral wisdom, understanding the quiet physics of the earth, and refusing to give up when the cold comes testing at your door.